Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Ford, and we are here for the final part 6 of a 6-part journey with Peer Gynt. The end of what was, for me, a very long and fairly confusing process, but I think we'll get into that. We've got 3 good things, 3 bad things, quotes, discussion, a rating and recommendation based on the text itself. 3 good things. 1, this is a fairly unpredictable text. As someone who has spent as much of his life and dedicated as much of his energy to literature as I have, it is always refreshing to not know where something is going. Not to say that even if you are able to predict where something is going, that it is going to be a letdown once you get there, or is going to get there in a predictable fashion. But I was uprooted during this. Number 2, we go a lot of places. This is not necessarily always a positive, but these places are made different enough by Ibsen in the text that they are interesting to see, they are interesting to experience, and they add to the story as opposed to simply being plot points or being, rather than the author simply telling us we are someplace else. He makes the reader feel someplace else as the reader is reading. And number 3, that conceptualization of the afterlife and of recycling, sort of, I think that's where that conceptualization of the afterlife was going. A recycling of souls and the usefulness of each life as it is presented, and that each life is presented with a specific meaning in mind. These things are interesting. They are not, purely speaking, Christian, for sure. And it is, when you get into something like that, what you're allowing the author to do is you're allowing the author to give you a meaning of life. There is that big question, what is the meaning of life? And for someone like myself, I think that the meaning of life is that we all get to choose our own meaning of life, and we just have to do our damnedest to make it worth it. This is not quite that conceptualization, but it is halfway maybe between the way I feel that the meaning of life is and what a Christian meaning of life might be. And it is interesting to see it presented in that fashion. 3 bad things. Number 1, I mentioned earlier, and I'll get back to it again, that this was unpredictable. But in that unpredictability, it is a bit disorienting. And it being unpredictable, plus number 2 of the good things, that we go a lot of places, plus number 3 of the good things, that there is an interesting conceptualization of something that is not often conceived, or at least given to us in the afterlife. All of those things put together make this text a bit disorienting. There is so much new being thrown at us, and there are so many new places being shown to us, and there is so little left for purchase that at times it is a very disorienting text for me. Number 2 of the bad things, it's very backloaded. Acts 4 and 5 are very long compared to the rest of the play, and that need not necessarily be a negative, but it is a negative when it feels that way. And I'm not sure, perhaps this is just me not being as well versed in plays, because Acts 4 and 5 were a good half of the story. That 3rd act was sort of a swing act, very short, and the first 2 were shorter than either of the later chapters as well. So it was a bit of a lopsided read as well. And I am not sure, it is difficult for me to really put that as a negative, because what ends up happening through that is Henrik Ibsen is absolutely positive that by the end of Act 1 you know Per. Knowing Per, there's no reason to draw out that process. You are then allowed to throw him into the story. And we get that. And Acts 4 and 5 are the... So, Acts 4 and 5, if you were to... I'll put this in terms of movies. Movie trilogies are the new popular thing to do. Acts 4 and 5, as they would normally be, if you're looking at something that's 5 acts, would feel like the third movie. Here, Acts 4 and 5 would be the second and third movie, which is good for what it's good for, but it also, for me, made this text feel very lopsided. And number 3, I have no strong feelings about this text. I enjoyed it. I will remember Per for a very long time. I will remember Asa for a very long time. I'm going to be stuck on that definition and conceptualization of the afterlife for a little while. Outside of that, I have no strong feelings about the text. I liked it. I read it. And it was, I think what it comes down to for me, I do not normally have a very strong connection with absurdist texts. And this felt to me very much like an absurdist text. So many things are thrown at you in such a fast fashion. And I did not necessarily find all of the literary representations underneath those things that might be necessary to find them anything but absurdist, if that makes any sense, and I'm not sure it does. Moving on to quotes. The first great quote that I got from this text comes from page 12. "They can't sneer the life out of my body." Christopher Hitchens said, part of growing up is saying the community can go to hell. And this quote, "they can't sneer the life out of my body," is a much more dignified way of saying that, but I think it gets to the very same point. And that quote from Hitchens, part of growing up is saying the community can go to hell, has always been a very near and dear saying to me. I've always been an outsider. So something like that is, it feels like a justification. And then getting it in this very dignified way here was just, it was gorgeous for me. Moving on, page 73 of the text. "What an enormous, limitless waste, far in the distance an ostrich is striding. What can one fancy was really God's meaning in all of this voidness and deadness? This desert bereft of all sources of life, this burnt-up cinder that profits no one, this patch of the world that forever lies fallow, this corpse that never, since earth's creation, has brought its maker so much as thanks. Why was it created? How spendthrift is nature." And I think that is, sorry, I've got to figure something out real quick with this. I got to hold on to that. This little bit of nihilism, almost smack dab in the middle of this text, this sense of void and hopelessness, but with absurdity all around. These are quotes that make me think this was sort of an absurdist text, but also one that's grounded in character and grounded in philosophy. And I'm not sure I ever found quite the underlying philosophy to it, but it is unmistakably there. This is a congruent text in the way, so it is congruent in the way a piece of clothing would be congruent, like a coat, but absurdist in its decoration, I think. I think that's the best way I can think to say this. This is an absurdist coat. It's a regular coat on the inside, but on the outside it's decorated in all sorts of funny manner. And my last quote from the text comes from page 100. "We are at loggerheads, fate and I." Just really like that quote. What's the quote from Shakespeare? Betwixt star-crossed lovers or something? I don't know. But that's paranoia that someone is doing something against the will of fate is something that is a long-standing tradition in literature, for sure, and I think it's because we all feel that way sometimes. And it's easy to fall into that feeling. And Pear is one of those characters that certainly gets you there. As for discussion, I wonder if there is a metaphor to be found in this text for getting lost in work and waking up and you're old, right? The big jump between finding a woman and being successful, the big time jump from when he finds Solvig and he builds a house and then he leaves and then he's successful out in the middle of nowhere. And even they don't like him. Even the businessmen there don't like him. But I think so after that, the midlife crisis and where he tries to find another woman, and then he's old. You find a woman, you basically fall asleep, and you're middle-aged and you've got some money, and you basically fall asleep and then you wake up and you're old and everything's gone. You wake up, and that's how it feels when he's being chased to be repatriated as a button. And I think that's something that I identify with quite a bit, because right after high school, I was working overnights, and then I was working 2 jobs, and then I got into 3 jobs, and I woke up and I was 24. And I felt like I was having a midlife crisis at quarter life. And that's when I sort of flipped out and moved off to college. And it's happening again to me a little bit, just getting caught in the grind of things. But what else is there necessarily? If you don't get caught up in some grind of some type, unless you're born independently wealthy or you strike it rich with something, not getting lost in work leads to never accomplishing anything, leads to never furthering your station in life. And Pear is one of those characters that starts without station in life. So it's very difficult to blame him for getting lost. It's very difficult to blame him at the beginning when he has no direction. And it's very difficult to blame him later on when he finds direction and he buries himself in that direction. There is a lot of humanity in this play all over. Pear is a screw-up. And like I just said, it's hard to blame him for being a screw-up. He comes from nothing. He lost his father. His father, when his father was alive, was a screw-up. His mother didn't know how to teach him to grow up and be a man. The community doesn't seem to like them. They're known as sort of they seem to be, it's never directly mentioned, but Pear is talked about in this way, and his mother is sort of sloughed off, and his father is talked about in this way, that they're sort of town outcasts as it is. So it's very very difficult to blame him for becoming what he became. Asa, like I said, loves her son. There's something very human about that. There's something you feel for Asa a lot through this. Her son's a screw up. She did the best she could, but even she knows, you get the feeling that that's not enough. And she only has him there at her bedside when she's dying. And what do? They go back to their old ways of charades, basically, of make-believe. In one of the most touching scenes of literature I've ever read, I mean, that was heartrending. Also, she was a widow. And that's something I don't know that I ever fully appreciated through this, because we find her with Per. And the piece being titled Per, we understand that that's who she has, that's who we'll be following. But I never fully paid respect to the fact that she was a widow. How long had she been a widow? How difficult was for her to raise that son? Where did she get the help when she needed it, when Per was still a boy? How early in life did Per have to become the man of the house? Further, Solveig loves Per. And the human element to her is that she's willing to wait for that love. She sacrifices essentially her entire life for those waning moments of this text in which she gets to be happy. That sucks, man. That sucks. And it's heavy. But we never get the sense that she's complaining about it. The troll princess, for what this is worth, the troll princess feels rejected. A little bit of humanity for the troll princess, but she seemed very willing to play into being wooed. So it's hard to feel too bad for her. And then she tries to come back and ruin it all for Per. Tries to ruin the happiness. That's what troll women do. The troll king, by the time we reconnect with him, seemed lost and distraught. The troll king, by the time we reconnect with him, seems to be where Per is by the time we leave him. And this is, there's maybe something meta to be done there, and I never really got that far with looking into this text, how it is that the troll king's life really mirrors Per's, and how does he end up at the end of things. At the end of all of this, I think that this is a story that largely invites us to judge ourselves. There's a lot of tricks that literature can pull, and there are a lot of meanings that we can derive from literature. And literature is, one of the things that separates us from any other animal is that we're able to project, we're able to imagine, we're able to forecast. Largely, that's all literature is. It is the ability, the ability to project as a human and forecast is to do thought experiments. And this is one of the great advantages we have over nature, in that so early in humanity, probably we were throwing rocks at things to try and kill them and eat them. Rocks are pretty heavy, so maybe it would do us more good to throw lighter rocks, but maybe with a sharper edge, do a little more damage that way. So we pulled it off, and we did it. And then what would be better? Maybe a spear, because that would be easier to throw and have more impact on landing. And so that is one of the things that gives us an advantage over nature, is that ability to forecast, project, imagine. Literature is that. Make no mistake, literature is just that. That is what makes literature literature, as opposed to just writing and storytelling, which are all right for what they are. But for literature to be literature, it is to provide a canvas to let the reader grow. And this text allows us to grow, prompts us to grow, in my opinion, by inviting us to judge the self. And that doesn't have to be what literature does. Literature can say, hey, don't judge others, and it becomes a good text. Literature can say, hey, don't automatically accept others, and it becomes a useful text. But inviting one to judge oneself, it's a nice trick. In the beginning of this, Per is gregarious and rough, and he becomes successful and selfish. But like I said earlier, from where he's from, it's difficult to blame him. Still, we must blame him. And in our need to blame him for the things that he does wrong, for the ills that he causes, we've really got to look at ourselves. We've really got to take a step back and say, is it possible to be well-intending, as Per seems to mostly be, if not well-intending, at least not ill-intending, but much ill comes of him? So, with that being the case, as a reader, you have to look at this and open yourself up to judging yourself. What are those things in my life that I'm doing, which though I might be well-intended, and though it may be very hard to blame me for them, what am I doing to cause harm? Where can I still grow? We see Per grow. We see Per become successful. Mightn't we contrast that with the successes in our own lives? It's difficult to believe that anyone thinks they're not good at anything. It's difficult to conceptualize a person who believes they are a complete and utter failure at everything. Even if, and I'm gonna talk down on this, but it's not because it's inherently bad, it's just because I don't understand it. Gaming. I've known several people who thought that they were all for naught in life. But by God, if you throw in Call of Duty, they're going to call you out on it. And in that, they find maybe not worth or value, but at least status. And I've lost my place, lost my train of thought. So this story opens us up to questioning ourselves even in those things that we find that we're good at, in which we find value, and through which we try to express ourselves. This opens us up to questioning those things and forces us very much to look inside. And the last thing I want to talk about here is heredity. Per's mother was a storyteller and her father was a screw-up. And we've said many times throughout this, sure, it's difficult to blame Per for, or I've said many times throughout this, it's difficult to blame Per for the things that he became. Did he have any choice in what he became? His character seems to be a 50-50 blending of the characteristics that we get from either of his parents. So it is, I think there's some question there to be raised. Look at the other places he goes. He ends up in the troll kingdom. Well, trolls are going to be trolls because they're born to be that way. Look at the other things he does. He finds those other businessmen, and he's successful in his business. But scoundrels are going to be scoundrels. And then he ends up on a boat. And that's when he's really taken out of his element. He's able to craft all of the other elements of the story to fit him, except when he's on that boat. Even when they come to collect him, he's able to swing that in his own favor. Sort of because he's a scoundrel, and sort of because he's a storyteller. What choice does Per have in the life that he leads? I think that's a question that the text at least invites us to ask, if nothing else. So a rating, what would I give this? I would give this 78 buttons out of 100. Though I really want to read it again at some point, because I don't think this is a static story for me. I think this is something that upon a second read, I would either like it a lot more or be aggravated that knowing where it goes and not having to try to project where it goes, that I would really dislike. I'm not sure. I think it would a second read I really think would swing me one way or the other. And what would I recommend based on this? I think if you like Per, you would really enjoy Charles Bukowski's poetry. I really do. This is a guy who is not the best of individuals, but never particularly claims to be. And we're able to look at him and learn something about ourselves. And that is something that is true throughout Bukowski's poetry as well. So that's what I've got for this, the 6th in a 6-part series, battling through Per Gynt by Henrik Ibsen. If you like this sort of thing, make sure you hit the subscribe button, because this is what I do here on the channel. Hit the like button if you want to help me out on the channel, and if you really want to help me out on the channel, sharing this on some form of social media always helps me grow. And I hope to see you back for the next episode of poetry or short stories or plays or novels or whatever it is we decide to do here on the channel.